Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2.
Chapter 13.
Despite the encroaching darkness, Nara pressed on, rejuvenated by the awakening that may or may not have been initiated by the spectral presence of the long-dead Dark Lord of the Sith. The questions came in a tumultuous rush, but she deliberately dismissed every one of them, having no interest in picking apart any of the details of her enlightenment because they didn't matter to her. Nara mattered now. Xana had pointed that out. Only she herself was responsible for destroying the veil, as Xana had put it. Despite the bleakness of the reality she had uncovered, Nara was undeniably at ease with her surroundings. What she knew to be a hideous and disgusting landscape, or even a blight not days ago, was in fact a natural beauty she could not ignore. A result of the freedom she felt coursing through her, she thought? Perhaps, but really, did it matter? The twin spirals crowning the canyon walls stood as beacons in the dying light of Ambria's sun. The deep red stones spiraled upwards, cresting at their points nearly 100 meters above their keep-like foundations. Whether from some natural secretion within the stone itself or simply an illusion caused by the waning light, they appeared to bleed to Nara's eyes as she compared the sight to light reflecting off water. The effect wasn't lost on her. Her attention was drawn to the canyon, its entrance an open maw of unnatural darkness. She knew it would be wiser to camp here and trek forth at first light, but she was compelled to do this right here and now. Nara had no idea how she knew this, only that she did. She had pieced together that whatever interaction between herself and Xana met had everything to do with learning particular lessons in some unknown order. Instinctively, she pulled herself up short of taking that first step into the inky blackness, not wanting to trade one master for another, even if that master was herself in some changed notion of attaining skills or knowledge she had come for in the first place. Nara wanted nothing more than to be independent in her thoughts and actions, and understood the lessons were the key to achieving just that. She had just decided to take the first step in when she felt Eerie give her a hard shove from behind with the crown of her head. Knocked off balance, Nara stumbled forward, scattering pebbles and loose dirt. After regaining her footing, she spun around to scold her, only to find both her thumpers had quickly sprinted in opposite directions, one back toward the lake and the other to her ship. Right, Nara exclaimed out loud with a deep sigh. She looked down at the feline, the only companion to remain. So, compassion and courage betray me, yet fear remains. She shook her head and rolled her eyes skyward before turning to face the canyon again. As it's too dark in there for me to see anything, I must rely on you, my friend. She brought her hand up and absently stroked the long, soft hairs spanning its spine, then placed her hand on his shoulder. She felt the animal's even breath and slow heartbeat and realized it was entirely at ease. Nara closed her eyes slowly and just as slowly drew in the force, ebbing it from everything unseen around her to flow into her. As before, the influx was at once overwhelming. A commingling of what she felt, where eddies of both light and dark energies enveloped her in their combined embrace. Her very bones seeped with raw force energies, but unlike before, this time, she was ready for it. She took a moment to fully immerse herself into the experience. She could feel her blood flowing throughout her body and was acutely aware of every muscle within her, primed and ready for whatever she needed them to do. Her mind was focused and clear, opening to the possibilities of what lay ahead instead of cowering in the face of the unknown. Time to let your presence be known, Cat. She hesitated, opened her eyes and stared into the dark again. Cat. No, that won't do. You'll need a name. A name for my new friend. Interesting. These thoughts of forming attachments were at odds with her previous way of thinking, and it gave her pause. It was a Jedi's impulse, she supposed, and how odd she found that thought now. Nara concentrated on the cave, and she could feel the presence of many beings before her, heard whispered mutterings between them, and could hear the sound of metal raking over stone. Something else caught her attention, a soft, muffled by the rest. Like dry leather brushing over loose stone, the sound was almost unidentifiable, but it was present in all directions, above her, to either side, but predominantly forward. She knew she could utilize her abilities to estimate locations, but her vision was all but useless within the unnatural darkness. Nara pulled at the force, leeching it from the rocks, the ground at her feet, every outlet and orifice she could. The power grew, and she channeled it almost to her breaking point, then released it in its entirety, and it exploded out from her. The force was so intense it cleaved stone from stone and stripped flesh from bone. Immediately, the cave was filled with screams of torment and agony, destroying everything in its path. It ripped through the vast chasm, echoing off the high walls, combined with boulders crashing, resonating metallic clangs, and the scampering of legs. The calving of the high canyon walls splintering from their foundations brought Nara to her knees with ear-splittering shatters. Dust rose and then settled in the silence. Unable to visually process the aftermath, she could only imagine the devastation she had unleashed as the carnage plundered the depths of the canyons beyond. Just then a rhythmic orchestra of guttural shouts and pledges in primitive languages began to rise out of the depths. Drum beats Nara had expected began echoing their way toward her, the shouts combining to both accentuate the percussions as well as to portray their numbers. The metal clanging on metal began to add to the war song as each participant clashed their crude weapons together. Although she wasn't afraid, she began to realize this lesson would be anything but simple. Annihilation is impressive, but that is the path of the Sith. Do you reclaim allegiance then? Nara heard Zana whisper. It was her voice, yet Nara could sense a change within it, an echo that hadn't been there initially. I do not, Nara replied, getting to her feet. Seeking the quick and easy path can result in an exponentially larger threat in the long run. Nara heard the echo again, deep and guttural, primal. It can, yes, but it can also flesh out the sum of your adversaries. Her thoughts presented through the gravelly voice of Sidious. She knew the reply sounded stupid, and this lesson had already proven it wrong, although the resounding clatter from those beyond her spoke otherwise. You are or were a Sith yourself, Xana. You know this, she added, thinking through the strategy. It was not Xana at all this time. The answers you seek lie before you, young one. You've only scratched the surface as you've learned the truth of yourself today. The voice belonged to the echo, completely, with no trace of the melodic tone Xana brought to the conversation. Thick with an unidentifiable accent, she had a tough time deciphering the words and had to work them through her mind. Nara understood enough of the message to come to terms with the lesson before her. Whether it was or whether it wasn't, the voice had meant for her to locate it obviously through this canyon, yet she could not see through the darkness, even through the Force. She let herself drop to the ground, crossing her legs as she pondered her dilemma, feeling her companion at her side, seating himself as well. Nara reached a hand absently for the shock of hair at his mane and began petting it softly, hearing but not listening to the clamor of the rhythmic drum beats and the steady chants echoing off the stone walls. She stroked at the cat's fur and found herself slightly swaying to the thumping of the drums, clearing her mind of distraction and meditating on her focus. Those before her were not advancing. She would need to go to them. She turned her head toward the cat and began to wonder if the cat itself was the key to her progress and this lesson. Courage and compassion turn away. I am left with fear, but fear remains idle. I am not afraid and can proceed alone, but fear will not leave my side. Fear itself is the key. She spoke through her thoughts, feeling the cat turn its head toward her, studying her. It let loose a deep rumble purr under her touch and forced its head into the palm of her hand. Fear shows compassion and courage, she said out loud, understanding why Eerie and Quinn had headed in the other direction. Eerie and Quinn, she said softly to herself. Nara rolled through the names several times and recalled her experiences with both. She felt the answers within her grasp and suddenly shot from the ground, her eyes flying wide. You have no name, she said, turning fully to the cat. At once, the drum beats ceased, returning the canyon to utter silence when the echoes receded to nothingness. Mushi, she proclaimed, calling out fear in her native tongue of Marillion. Upon identifying the fear that had made itself her companion, her eyesight immediately returned, yet it was not hers. She was seeing the canyon through the eyes of the cat at her side. The effect was both nauseating and discombobulating. She forced herself to adapt to this new perspective. She wanted to pull away and release her bond to the altered view, yet she knew deep down this was the key to proceeding. Instead of withdrawing from the experience, she pushed deeper into it, forcing herself into the cat's mind and into the mind of Mushi. Nara slowly knelt on the hard ground, placing her hands gently upon her knees and further linking her mind to Mushi's. She stretched out the force again and felt each muscle within the cat's frame, and then pushed him to spring from his hind legs toward the closest figure. Mushi closed the distance between himself and the black-clad humanoid faster than she thought possible. Nara didn't even get a clear view of the target before Mushi's massive paws extended their razor-sharp claws, decapitating the figure with a left swipe and gutting it with a right. Mushi didn't waste time at the kill site, setting his focus on the next, and the next, and the next, leaping from rock to canyon wall, mutilating bodies as he went. Through his eyes, Nara could see the physical destruction she had caused with her force wave, and could see that the fallen stones were providing launch points for the big cat to exact his carnal rampage through the canyon. It was glaringly obvious to her now that these two events were symbiotic. Her actions had provided him with a path forward, the two working in tandem together. Had Zaina and her companion, for that matter, known she would tap into her instincts before anything else? If so, was simply avoiding the canyon even an option for them? No, she knew this because she had never considered it an option. Nara felt the weight of consistency pressing hard upon her, how she felt in control of herself here in Ambria's versus the reality of what she was learning about herself and the Force. Mushi left up to a high ledge where three humanoid forms stand unmoving. Nara realized how far the feline had traversed while she'd been victim to her thoughts. He did not advance, seeming to wait for her presence or permission to finish his task. Nara wasn't sure. She took a moment to inspect the humanoids, coaxing the cat mentally to remain idle. Whatever features they held were hidden under tattered rags and long ribbons of black cloth. They stood on 2 feet, heavily wrapped, each brandishing primitive blades in both hands, crossed before their chests. Behind them, 2 more figures stood idle, facing each other at the mouth of the cave entrance. A small, leather-bound drums resting before their chests. An eerie silence descended upon the scene and soon spread to her vantage point from just within the canyon walls. Nara knew she had to make her way to Mushi alone, but she had no idea how and wanted no part in asking for assistance. She would figure this out on her own. Nara thought through everything that had transpired since, well, from the beginning, she decided. She pressed herself to remember the details of her dreams from the first night here on Ambria, how Unduli had presented herself as a shadow, similar in most ways to the figures falling under Mushi's claws. She replayed her former master's actions, particularly the death of Kimion, and came to understand the meaning of it. Luminara Unduli was still trying to protect her, even in death. Despite the action transpiring in a dream state, she could not deny the power and symbolism of the spiritual link she had felt, which continued even now. There is more than just a link through memory, she said out loud as she worked through her thoughts. Zaina's voice was proof enough of that. The second voice, the primal, deep resonating voice, although unrecognized, sounded as ancient as time itself, and neither was known to her before landing on Ambria. The link was anything but cerebral, she thought. It was spiritual. Then she understood why her force wave was semi-effective. It had torn through the physical, yet it would not stem the projection of a spiritual link, nor hold to the physical realm. She knew then that the dark side was all but useless to her here. The alternative seemed ludicrous, but she could not stomp out the possibility of drawing upon the light. This now presented her with a new enigma. She was a clone. Your link to the Force has nothing to do with either physiology, young one, Zaina interrupted Nara's thoughts. Nara had no idea how to respond to that. We feel your conflict, Nara. It is time to understand the truth of yourself, and through that endeavor, the truth in all things. We, Nara thought, and more importantly, what truth? Her confusion threatened to break her concentration, and with that her link to Mushi. Varys began her path, basking in the light. Though her clone, that past also belongs to you, Zaina answered her thoughts in part. As to we, all of those who have come and gone before you have understood the truth the Force possesses. You're speaking of middle ground, utilizing both dark and light aspects, Nara responded. Yes. By removing the extremes, you're only left with the middle, the primal voice responded, surprising Nara. It is why Sidious has failed at every attempt to delve into Ambria's secrets, Zaina added. Nara was at the precipice of losing her concentration and Mushi altogether. Her thoughts were consumed by bafflement and outright hopeless confusion. My lady, I've read the manuscripts, myself authored by Dark Cognus. You are Darth Zaina, are you not? Whom she quoted to vanquish Darth Bane before her very eyes. Nara managed to hold her tethered to Mushi by a thread. The same. And the duels was fought far from where we are currently sitting, Zaina replied. My story is better suited for another time in its entirety, and one I will freely share. In the meantime, hear the words of Thawne and bridge the connection. She finished. Nara had heard the name before, or read it through her diligent studies of ancient manuscripts. The Chuktai, Nara said softly. The resonant voice began to laugh deeply. The same, Nara, he explained while exiting his laughter. The voice was felt more than heard, and it beat upon her chest in waves destined to call all attention to it. You are correct, Zaina. This one we can teach. Nara heard the words and knew they were solely for her benefit. She knew both were long dead, Thawne by eons, and that whatever link they had to her physical realm was spiritual by both definition and practice, thereby moving deliberate speech into the realm of the relevant. She could not help but think of how she had already succeeded in areas where Sidious had not, and how her superficial grasp of primal logic created the difference. How to adapt that thought toward her progress in the present rushed into her mind. Is the darkness simply a projection of my ignorance, then? She wondered how to shred this veil, if that were the case. Embracing the light within her seemed the logical step forward. However, Thawne had been a Jedi Grandmaster. How can there be a middle ground? Nara laughed to herself, a light chuckle that filled the silence before her as it softly echoed off the fallen stone. In the depths of her Sith embrace, she had learned of the Choktai. She had spent hours in study of manuscripts cast off by her own master that had led her into a deeper understanding of Darth Zaina. How were the two of them now conjoined here on Ambria? This desolate wasteland had found itself in the very middle of her narrative. Nara had come to this planet in pursuit of something her master did not possess, on his behalf and for his benefit. But now she realized that pursuit had changed since landing to be about her. I am not a Sith, Nara said with a defiant frown. I am not a Sith. She said the words louder this time, pushing herself up from the ground. I am not a Sith, she raised her voice, nearing a shout, but she wasn't satisfied. I am not a Sith, she shouted into the reverberating echoes of her previous statement. I am not a Sith. The force of her shout shook the canyon walls, sending rocks careening to a shattering demise. The veil of darkness lifted. Nara was shocked to see just how deep an embrace the dark side had on her. She gasped, feeling a rush of force energy into her. It was the light side, and more substantial and pure than anything she had ever experienced through memory or practice. The unalloyed essence and energies of the warm light infiltrated every cell, all thought, filling the vacated void and embracing her wholly and entirely. Somewhere in the middle, she thought to herself as the influx subsided. She took a moment to survey the devastation of her force wave, now through her own eyes. She thought back to her encounter with Ahsoka on Mustafar and how she had been on the receiving end of that same effort. Her mind lingered on the thought of her old friend, wondering if the Torguda would even entertain that idea anymore, and she was a little surprised that friend was the adjective she used regarding the memories of her former colleague. In the new metaphoric light she had created, she examined herself. Her hair was loose and blowing gently about her shoulders in the Ambrian night. Clad in a simple black tunic, scuffs, scrapes, and dried blood caked her legs, her bare feet wrapped around the fallen stone. What a sight, she said, shaking her head. Yet she had never felt more confident or more at ease with her appearance. She strode forward to take up position beside Mushi, her fear. Following the cat's path over the broken stone, she noticed that the victims of his raking claws were nowhere to be seen. There were no fallen weapons either, no shreds of torn cloth, only occasional print left by the feline where the ground was soft and small pebbles and motes of dust. It took less time than she had expected to ascend to Mushi's rise, cresting the flat rock, expecting to see the 5 figures. Only the giant cat sat respectively before the cavernous entrance in her view as she pulled herself up and cleared the stone ledge. She realized now there had never been anyone here opposing her. Lesson learned, Xana, she said to herself, understanding that she had only faced what she had brought with her. It seems the lessons do not differ much between Jedi and Sith. She gave Mushi's head a scratch. It was Thawne who responded. In truth, they do not, only in the mind of the beholder, as it were. Nara felt a nagging tug of sorts in the back of her mind that she could not explain. She admitted that it brought itself to her subconscious attention when she had renounced her master, but now it was more pronounced in uniform. She quickly eliminated the possibility that it was a byproduct of what was at work before her, as it felt closer to an emotional bond at the summit of ceasing to be. She was not sure she could have formed an emotional bond with anyone before coming to Ambria that could hold such sway, only that it was inexplicable in her current state of being. No, there were 2, she corrected herself. One was easy and came to mind quickly in the form of resentment, something she had said to Ahsoka within the encounter that remained fresh in her memory, or rather the reaction Ahsoka had spoken of concerning her attitude toward clones. In this moment, she honestly wished she could replay that conversation and talk to Ahsoka again on a different level, including her recent discoveries. She did understand what it meant to share an identity with another, many others in fact. The thoughts elicited an anger she wanted no part of now. She did not want to rekindle a connection to her anger so closely timed with her extraction of the dark side. Nara recentered her thoughts on Ahsoka as they, for reasons she couldn't explain currently, helped root her to the immediacy of her focus. Good, young one. You will need allies, Xana said, snapping Nara out of her thoughts for the moment. The comment swirled through her mind several times before resonating. Allies. Nara hadn't intended to ask. Allies is a word only applied in concerns of conflict. She found herself reciting passages written eons prior. Nara, we all stand before the greatest conflict this galaxy has faced since Thawne's time. Light, dark, allegiances will matter little in the end. Xana responded in a more concerned voice than Nara had heard her use to this point. Xana speaks the truth, child, Thawne added, a grave tone adding depth. Mushi swiveled his head slowly to look into Nara's eyes briefly before tilting his head to nudge her back, pushing her slightly forward into the mouth of the cave. Nara understood the gesture. What's in there? She asked as she slowly walked forward. Truth. Both Xana and Thawne responded together. Nara stepped through the cave's entrance, feeling a genuine warmth she knew was unnatural, the stone walls reflecting the heat source, not the source themselves. She felt a raw power flowing freely through the air she breathed, and a sudden wave of wholeness consumed her. The darkness of Ambria outside was only amplified by the complete lack of light within. Nara's hand instinctively went to her saber hilt, and she brought the weapon before her, igniting the blade, bathed the small chamber in its crimson glow. She glanced at Mushi and saw he hadn't moved beyond the nudge he had given her. He was still seated at the mouth of the cave. She turned back to the small chamber, noting the tooling marks adorning its walls. Scanning the stone surface with the light of her saber's blade, she could see drawings and etching in various poses scratched into the cave surface and ceiling. Ancient as they were, time-worn, and hardly decipherable. One such drawing depicted a quadruped, a hoofed animal with a humanoid torso, arms outstretched above its head. Another depicted a vast area of water with several humanoid forms falling into it. She could only guess at their meaning. Just then her gaze fell upon the chamber's rear wall, and the fist-sized hole carved, no, burned into it. Intrigued, she lifted her hand to touch the stone's warm surface, brushing her fingertips over the rough exterior, before coming to rest at the strange opening in the rocky wall. Without thinking and without knowing what she would find, Nara plunged her hand deep into the pocket, scraping her knuckles painfully against the stone at the rear. She felt along blindly until her fingers found a solid form, something cylindrical and metallic. Steeling herself, she wrapped her fingers around the object and pulled it out in one swift motion. Scraping knuckles forgotten, she brought the ignited saber close to inspect her newfound item, finding no luster on its blackened surface. There was a small black button midway on the circumference of the tube, and an opening on one end with a clear, crystalline cap. Throwing caution to the wayside, she pointed the opening away from her toward one of the walls and hit the button. The item chirped once, then whirled in her hand as a sputtering light illuminated the stone before her. A severe snap startled her, and the floor shifted violently. Nara felt as if time had stopped as she focused on the dazzling light. She saw movement within its blue hue just before the floor tilted away, and she plummeted into the ebony abyss